Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, aneighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Rise of Anti-Humanism. That's the article by Matthew B. Crawford in First Things, published in August of this year. I'm your host, David Gornoski, with my friend and editor at aneighborschoice.com, Surit Dasgupta. How you doing, Surit?
Hey, I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
Good. Now, let's look at this story. Now, I like Matthew Crawford's work because he's one of the few writers on the scene that he writes essays and he writes books and he does a whole host of things. He talks about the forgotten world of mechanical work, and he talks about the world of the motorcycle, the open road, but he also talks about a lot of things that have corollary interests with what we have been talking about on this program, Things Hidden, and a Neighbor's Choice, our radio show, and just a host of different stuff that I've been writing about for years kind of dovetails with what he's doing. So I like to riff off of sometimes, to take someone like Matthew Crawford, who's not, as far as I understand, taking a anthropological mimetic approach, but he ends up going in that direction. And in fact, he does talk about the need for a proper anthropology, and he talks about the need to have incarnation. I don't know if he's a Christian or just Christian friendly or what, but he's got a lot of great insights, and I always like to see other people's angles on how they write and frame things to pull from. So first of all, I want to lay out something that I think is at the heart of a lot of the problems that people have in encountering the approach to understanding Jesus in our current events, the way we try to explain it. And I think it has to do with a problem I call belief-ism. It's different from fideism, which is like faith for faith's sake without any. But this belief-ism is more about propositional mental assent about facts in history. And the general thought along this line that I think a lot of Christians get hung up on is belief-ism. This idea that if I believe in the proper facts about Jesus's life, in his work, and if I believe those things happened, for example, I believe he came into history, he was born of a virgin, he suffered and died and was buried, and he rose again, right? If these are propositional claims, really, you're saying this is an event, these are events that happen in history. Do you believe those things happen? Yes. Okay, therefore you're Christian. Now, the problem with that is, I think it limits. I think it's important to have a creed. I don't have any problem with a Nicene Creed per se, but it has to be situated in a context that I think a creed in that framing can't fully, take into account. And that is, our job is not to have a kind of faith that is in a static relationship about certain axiomatic facts of history that if we believe they happened and if we do certain rituals in accordance with those facts. And if we do those rituals in the right place and in the right, institution, therefore we are Christian. All those things are still, in my opinion, just a small piece of the pie. The bigger picture that Jesus emphasizes again and again and again in his performative art of his life as depicted in the Gospels and the other epistles and prophecies of the Old Testament is that you must become and imitate and be him in order to experience and participate in the new creation project and what he calls the kingdom of heaven. And so, with that said, let me give you an analogy. I think, sir, you might appreciate this. Thomas Jefferson. Suppose that someone said, in order to partake of the benefits of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights that Thomas Jefferson was, he had he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he was very much involved with the atmosphere of the Bill of Rights. Suppose that one were to say, well, in order for you to participate in the benefit of the First Amendment, in the benefit of the Second Amendment, in the reality of the Fourth Amendment, one must believe that Thomas Jefferson was born in the place in which history says he was born, and accept the principles of his life, accept the facts of what he did and what he invented and where he went and who he married and who his kids were, and believe that he died and believe that he was the president and believe that he wrote the Declaration of Independence. You must believe all of those facts. And if you truly believe those things happened, and if you truly believe that he wrote the Declaration of Independence and that he did so with the intention to help protect the rights of mankind against despots, then and only then do you get to receive the benefits of the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you that someone would say that? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty accurate. And
What's
also,
accurate? Wait a sec. I want to make sure we're getting this clear here because it's a little bit of a thought experiment I'm doing. What's accurate?
yeah, similarities between belief in a civic sense and belief in a religious sense, right? So I kind of, yeah, I mean, we have to believe in certain things, and then only you will be the inheritors, and so on and so on. It's an overemphasis on belief, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. This kind of, again,
yeah,
first of all, let's be clear. The word belief, as I'm using it, is not the word that in the New Testament they use the word belief. That's a trust, right? It's a different kind of existential word. Belief, as I'm using it, is again a product of our modern times in which we say, I am a neutral observer and I am persuaded by the facts of history and I can accept these facts or accept these facts, whichever one is true is what I will believe, right? And that's just totally alien from the way in which the New Testament thinks about the word belief and or the word that we render belief in the English translations. The word pistis is just a completely different. It means trust, like a marital, like devotion. So I just want to make this clear for folks, and maybe we can flesh this out, sir, if it needs further clarification for the audience. But I want people to understand how absurd it is to narrow their conception of faith in Jesus in a beliefism approach, because and the only way to be able to do so is to show its parallel analogies with someone like a Thomas Jefferson, right? Does that make sense?
yeah, and this is of course, like, if people would say that the word belief has only one meaning throughout history, they would be committing word concept fallacy, right? The word belief has taken on a kind of pseudo gnostic connotation, and today, like, we have this dialectical reasoning in our mind of, pitting faith against works. And this, like, one of the key points of divisions within the church. There's a lot of heated arguments that are happening over this. uh so as faith is related in a lot of ways to belief. It's not surprising that we see people when they think about belief in relation to what you were talking about. They take on a kind of mental assent, a kind of a worldview that depends on having the right belief in order to get salvation, or in order to get some sort of social acceptableness, or
Right. And even
acceptability.
and even the faith institutions and traditions in church that are more works oriented still typically, unfortunately,
They operate by the same dialectic,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Well, not just the dialectic, but there's still like even the one. Let's say the ones that are more works oriented and they get accused of works righteousness. Typically, the way they're popularly, I don't want to indict the actual church teachings of any particular group. I'm just saying the way they're popularly conceived, even the more works oriented branches of Christianity still kind of assume an axiomatic mental assent model for what it means to have faith, right? Like, I believe, like, someone tells you there was a guy named Jesus and he did this and he did that and he did this on the cross. And if you believe this and if you say you're sorry to him or something like that, and then, then the other institutions, they'll say, well, no, actually, you have to have baptism. But you still had to mentally assent to the concept that baptism is the thing that saves you, not belief in those things. They would say baptism precedes belief, right? A lot of church institutions and church denominations would say, baptism is actually what is the entrance point into the kingdom of heaven or whatever. Others would point to other types of sacraments, the Eucharist. You must believe, and even the mystical churches, right, that believe that like eating the Eucharist is eating the body and blood literally of Christ. They're still hinging it, unfortunately, if you really look at the way it's popularly conceived, on you must axiomatically believe that that's what's going on for it to have effect on you, which again, I find that to be ridiculous, really, because I don't think that belief axiomatically is has nothing to do with what it means to follow Christ, not at all. But I don't think it's the ground by which one becomes a Christian, really. I think that what Christianity, when you have an anthropology grounding your approach to what Jesus did in history, you realize that uh, the effects of Christ's kingdom affect you whether you believe in them or not. You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm trying to get at right now. You can the effects, the change of history happens to you whether you believe in those facts or not. Whether you believe that Jesus died and rose again, his doing so has objectively changed the reality of human beings living in light of that happening in history 2,000 years ago. It objectively changes the context of their relationships, the context of their so-called rights in relationship to others, their cultural framework of who they are as a person, their ability to do certain things. All these things have been objectively changed by this event in history. And in the same vein of, again, to use my Thomas Jefferson analysis, if you're born in America, right, there are certain effects of Thomas Jefferson's contribution to the founding of this republic that you get to be beneficiary of, whether you believe Thomas Jefferson was born in 17 whatever, died in 17 whatever, right? Or 18, excuse me, 18. I think he died on 4th of July, like John Adams, but 18 something. But whether you believe those proper facts about him, all right, or whether you believe in the correct interpretation, you can layer it on. There's belief layers on. Like, so first belief is like, do you believe Thomas Jefferson was born in this time, that he lived here, that he said these things, and that he did these deeds, and that he had this writings, and he had these ideas? And the person says, yes, I believe those things. Okay, now you get to benefit from those First Amendment. No, it doesn't work like that. You get to participate, whether it's a good thing or not. I'm not talking about the goodness of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or any of that right now. I'm just talking about being an American. You get to benefit from the effects. You get to receive, let's just say a more neutral word, you get to receive the effects of Thomas Jefferson's actions and life, whether you believe that he existed or not. Does that make sense, sir?
Well, I mean, like, I appreciate the way you're just juxtaposing Jefferson's uh, event with the event of Jesus, because there's a very I mean, I don't know if that is your intent or not, but I'm catching a very subtle difference between the way we approach those two events. So uh, the history, we know that Jefferson existed. We have numerous documentations, numerous testimonies. We have all sorts of evidence for Jefferson existing. And we as Christians tend to not look at Jesus in the same way. So I think a crude example, but I think which is relevant, is like how we two are having conversations right now. So we are conversing it under the assumption that yes, both of us know that the other one is real, and the other one is pretty much an active for current force in history. And but even Christians, they don't approach Jesus in the same manner, right? They approach Jesus in the sense that he is some kind of a phantom, some kind of uh, uh, a being that exists only in the spiritual dimension, let's say, right? So I think that there are very notable consequences to approaching Jesus in that sense. One, it sorts of dismisses the effect that Jesus has in actual human history, and two is that uh, how how much can we say that we have faith when we have not really dealing with this one historical figure in reality, in the same way we approach Jefferson. So if somebody in America right now says, I have doubts or disputes about Jefferson and so on and so on, but he still has the privilege of being an American citizen, right?
Yeah, and again, let's not even use the word. I mean, I know it's kind of a distraction, but just to be clear, let's not even use the word privilege. Just to say the benefit you are
The benefit.
receiving. You're
Yeah.
receiving an identity of Americanism in your culture that Thomas Jefferson had a big role in making and shaping, right? uh, and you're receiving it whether you believe he existed or not, or whether you believe he wrote the Declaration of Independence or not, right? You're receiving the effects of the Declaration of Independence. You're receiving the effects of his contributions to the Bill of Rights. You're receiving his effects of his life, his deeds, his intentions have made an objective difference in the world that you are a recipient of, right? And even not even just Americans, but how many constitutions and so forth around the
Right.
world have echoing effects of what this man did in history, right?
Yes, yes,
Right.
that's true. Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to get people to see, and I think and I think you're seeing it very clearly as we've talked about in the past, which is that's the same way this kind of cartoonish notion we can't even fathom someone saying, yeah, Thomas Jefferson, I don't think he existed. Well, there's some people that say, I don't know if Jesus existed, right? And then a second question becomes, and you have to be fair. It's a longer period of history that we're looking back at the text of Jesus, but still, there's a bias we have towards like more recent texts being more reliable than more ancient texts, right? And that's because we're Christian, and we have an unconscious knowledge that perhaps maybe texts that are written in the way in
Yeah.
which a post Jesus, a post Jesus kind of demythologizing effect creates this kind of unconscious bias towards trusting in the narrative accuracy of those who write about the existence of an individual in more recent times versus someone from a farther period away, right? And we do know that there are
Yeah.
legends. But there are legends around the time of Thomas Jefferson. I mean, you have the legend of George Washington, cutting down the cherry tree and saying, "I shall not tell a lie," and telling his parents the truth. You have the legend of the Swamp Rider or something. I don't even know. There's a figure in the Revolutionary War that was fighting in the South in the swamp. You have the Scarlet Pimpernel, which is a story in books, I guess, is more clear. You have folktale legends like John Bunyan later on in American history, and these figures who had all these extraordinary powers. So legendary figures are a part of even recent history, but still, it doesn't make us doubt the existence of Thomas Jefferson. And my point is just simply that the way in which we view belief in Christianity is tantamount to this kind of truncated, dumb view that, in order to receive the effects of Thomas Jefferson's life, you must believe the proper facts about it.
All right, all right. I think I see your point more clearly now. So what you are basically alluding to here is that we are very clearly swimming in a saturated, gospel saturated environment, right? And that's a testimony or that Jesus existed. But at the same time, it's also a testimony to the fact of, that Jesus, when he talked about the rain falling on the just and the unjust at the same time, right?
Right.
So he was, I guess, like what I'm trying to say here is that uh, Jesus has had effect on history and our current time, whether you believe in him or not, right?
Right.
So he is an actual historical figure, and oftentimes we Christians dismiss this historical effect that Jesus has had in even in our time, and mostly in I mean we can see his effect and mostly in our time too, because the more as history progresses, the more we are haunted by the cross
Right.
that Jesus died on, right?
Well, yeah,
So
let me go ahead.
mhm.
Let me steel man the position of the so-called Christian foil that we're using right now, because I want to be fair. I would say that the most traditional and conservative and orthodox type Christians, and I'm using orthodox lowercase o, people who believe in, traditional claims of Christianity,
Right.
um, um, that they wouldn't deny the historical reality of Jesus. Let's be clear about that. They do accept the historical reality of Jesus, and they would, if you press them, if they're thinking about it, they would say, yeah, Jesus has had an effect on history. Whether you're a Christian or not, you've been affected by his life. I think they would say that too. So I don't want to, try to
Yeah,
I'm
but
not saying,
there's a
but
I get what you're
okay.
saying, and I see. I'm not trying to strawman them as well, but it's not in the same sense, though, right? Because I think many Christians, and by Christians I'm meaning like the I'm not saying like the very deep, full, thoughtful Christians. I'm saying those who identify as Christians. So they would be quick to say that the Beatles had more impact on music today, but they would not be as so quick to say that Jesus has influenced the world as much. Say like the Beatles influenced music and culture. So that's a discourse that a lot of Christians seem to, because Christians are generally preoccupied with the uh, the forces that are battling Jesus. There are
Yeah,
forces that are perceived as being opposite to Jesus.
right.
So their emphasis is much more on that part. But by doing that, they sort of undermine that we are actually history is actually ruled by Jesus even today,
Right.
right?
Yeah, and I would say that the problem with how Christianity is popularly conceived, at least in the West or whatever, as just my context of living and contending with what this is that it's it's almost like, okay, you have this historical Jesus that they believe, and they have all these historical claims that he died, buried, rose again, so forth and so on, and they believe those things, but it's almost like the historical Jesus is united to them by some kind of psychological archetypal legend Jesus, right? And
Right,
that
right,
and
yeah,
it's almost like a Carl Jung type, or what Jordan Peterson talks about with Jesus, which is this archetypal psychological experience. Now,
yeah, like
they don't use those terms, right? They would say, no, this is not a psychological experience. That's a diminishment of what's going on. It's a spiritual, relationship, but
right,
still it's functionally ends up kind of being the same thing, where it's like there was this historical figure, and they would say, don't you ever deny that there was a historical thing, or else you're not a Christian. But it's like the way in which you relate to that historical figure is this psychological, legendary, archetypal mental assent, right? If you mentally assent, that's the Gnostic part of it that you were talking about. If you mentally assent to these propositional claims about his life, his actions, his identity, right? You know, is he fully God, fully man, or half God, half man? You got to get all these things right. And again, I'm not diminishing the importance of trying to get the answers right. That's not what we're saying. But we're saying, is that the frame by which you have a relationship in the kingdom of heaven? I would say probably not, right? I would say that you're an American who experiences the social reality of a First Amendment, what's left of it, and a Second Amendment, whether you knew about Thomas Jefferson and believed the proper facts about his life and intentions or not, you receive it, right? And in the same
Right.
sense, because Jesus is the new Adam, he is the new creation, all human beings, particularly ones who have been most saturated by areas of the world which have been saturated by the story of Jesus and the mimetic kind of rippling effect of imitation. Because let's be clear here, the imitation of Jesus is why we know Jesus today. It was not just the text, but it's also the idea of historical people seeing his impact in their life and mimicking his impact to other people, and then those people mimicking it and mimicking it and mimicking it for 2,000 years down to the place where we're at today. That's
Right.
the
Yeah.
continual chain of imitation of existence of his way of being human that we are recipients of. And you're a recipient of it whether you believe he died and rose again or not. Now, should you believe the things? Sure, because they're true, right? But that's not the hinge by which you know God and get to experience his effect in history. Does that make sense?
Yes, one of the biggest impacts of Rene Girard's work is that uh you know signifying how making it important how how key is imitation to something that has been that has occurred in history, right? So like people today, even an atheist will say, I won't go around killing people, I won't go around robbing people. They will, although they will say that it's not because we have a Christian worldview, it's just that it's the decent thing to do. So the question remains, like, it's begging the question, why is it the decent thing to do to not go around killing people, right? So why is that the default state is my question. Why is it the default state of humanity to not go around killing people and robbing people? But it can just be so easily the opposite, right? Like, so that's a kind of apologetics thing, I guess. But to present a challenge to the conversation that we are having, is that we have seen all of these interesting undertaking by scholars, like the historical Jesus movement. I don't know if you know about this. It was pretty big back in the 90s or 80s, I think, where they were like uh, eager to just approach Jesus from a historical, modern academic point of view, right? And but the thing is that they came up with all sorts of things about how Jesus was really a more progressive, quote unquote, figure. Progressive in the sense of like the modern progressive, not in like a real genuine progressive person. So what I'm basically trying to say is that how do we know who the historical Jesus is? Uh, that's my question. So I don't know, like, you have, maybe you can add something to that.
Well, you have the stories of his life in the Gospels, and you have epistles and the rest of the stories in the Bible that give you a clue as to what he did. And then you have the impact of history based on the way in which his story has been mimetically transferred through the generations. And the effects of that give us an indication of the source and intention of this person in life and history that has had a desire to create a kingdom that is unlike anything else in the world, and that kingdom is growing, and that it has a peculiar way in which it operates through being expelled, usually through being marginalized, through being sacrificed. It grows in power. I mean, that's the trap that Jesus sets, because you have two choices when a culture becomes saturated with the experience of the gospel, as I call it, a technology. The gospel text, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and even the rest of the Bible, is all what I call gospel technology. It's like putting on glasses. You're able to see things that you couldn't see before. It's like having glasses where you look at something, it's blurry, you can't tell what you're looking at, you put on glasses, I see what that is, that's a tiger, I need to get out of the way. I mean, that's what the gospel is for humanity. It changes the way humanity looks at itself and looks at the world and looks at its relationship to others. And then what it allows it to do with that is extraordinary, because that's where other technologies are born from, that proper lens of the gospel technology affecting people through the slain victim of the foundation of the world, which is Jesus, uh, bringing forth to light all the victims that we have marginalized and created our cities based on, starting with Abel, the primordial first victim of the first city of humankind.
So, in other words, our modern overemphasis on the victim, right, which is what really drives the politics and everything that we see around us, entertainment and everything, right? It's always taking the side of the underdog, the victim, and so on, is kind of a testimony to Jesus crucified on the cross.
Yeah, and how far removed is that from? Let's go back. How far removed is that from the average popular conceived notion within Christianity about what the effects of Jesus should look like in history? The most they come up with is, the effects of Christianity in our culture today is we shouldn't abort kids, and we should be against gender reassignments, and what I mean. It's like, it's just whatever the latest.
But that's not really an effect, right? That's like that's a proposition, and we're talking about the fact before you're making the proposition. So, like, why are you saying that it's not it's
Right.
immoral to kill kids in the womb?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because most folks apply their Christianity as another ideological tool to their battles and culture, right? Or their neighbors, right? You see what I mean? So it's like, oh, Christianity is against abortion, so therefore, it's like an ad hoc tool. It doesn't realize, wait a second, everything about my world is a construct of Christianity. Even the errors are errors that have to operate under the dominion of Christianity and Jesus's kingdom. You know what I mean? Even the errors, the logic of the errors and mistakes and lies of our culture still have to operate under the dominion of Jesus's project in history.
Like for example, even the pro-choice argument has to rely primarily on that it's a fetus. It hasn't fully developed into a human being yet.
Right. I mean, they had abortion. Yeah, exactly. Abortion was common in the Roman Empire, but they didn't situate it as the expression of the protection of the woman and her needs. It was actually the father's prerogative whether he wanted to pull one of his children or not, right? And they had a window that they could kill the child due to exposure. They could just leave it out to exposure. And there were some rules, and they rolled back exposure. The Roman Empire actually later on, stopped. They kind of banned exposure, but it still continued. But they banned it because they were concerned about not having enough children to execute some of the things that were needed in the labor market in the Roman Empire, like soldiers and civic workers and civil workers and stuff like that. So they actually
and also
they actually did. I just want to be clear. They actually did repeal by law. They made it against the law to do exposure, which is to allow the child to die out in the middle of nowhere. but it was only a pragmatic sense of trying to produce more labor individuals for people to be
Yeah, it was
fundamentally.
something that came out of the need to preserve differentiation as opposed to, seeing a real value in human life.
Right, right.
So it's like the same kind of arguments that exists for the caste system, right?
Go ahead, elaborate.
Well, I mean, the caste system is like, if you talk to any modern day Hindus, they will say there's a logic behind the caste system in that it is a division of labor, right? And it's like the existence of classes preserve differentiation. It doesn't
Right,
give cause to like it doesn't make it possible for chaos and sameness among all people, because if we had that, then society would not operate correctly.
right, right,
It's not a, it's the caste system. The argument for caste system cannot be made from a perspective of seeing the dignity of dignity of value in all human life. It's
right,
purely from a pragmatic utilitarian
right, right.
perspective, and
That that
that's
brings
how
up
the Romans. Yeah,
that brings up a great point too. That one of the things that gets laid at the feet, you'll see this on Twitter and other online, conversations where people are trying to say, people who are into Nietzsche or whatever are trying to say that Christianity is the one that produces egalitarianism in history. And I would say, no, that's not correct.
right,
Egalitarianism is a reaction to Christianity's impact in history. It's a kind of, again, it's an error that operates within the framework of what Christianity allows for it to operate. It tries to critique Christianity with Christianity's own principles, but in so doing, it still is an error because it doesn't understand, what Christianity is really about, and it wants to rebel against it. But egalitarianism is the erasure of any differences between individuals and any hierarchy, right? And Christianity is not egalitarian. What Christianity does is it eliminates, there are unjust hierarchies in some cases, so there is some kind of leveling effect, but that's not inherently egalitarian. What Christianity does is it eliminates the threat of sacrificial violence behind differentiation and hierarchy. So it doesn't say that you can't have hierarchy. It doesn't say that, for example, men and women are completely not that they're completely identical, right? That would be a lie. And Christianity is always about the truth. But what it would say is we're not going to mediate that difference through the threat of violent expulsion by women or whoever else is on the down the down market at that time in history. Right now, it's starting to turn into men in the West being on
right,
the down market of that relationship. But what Christianity does is it doesn't say everything's equal by force. That's what egalitarianism does. What Christianity does is say, get rid of the force that makes things, get rid of the violence that props up hierarchies and differentiation, and allow people to voluntarily learn to do these things with love. So, let me give it an analogy. Like, for example, in the Roman world, if you had a child that was born with severe handicaps, it was almost no question that you would allow that child to be killed. In fact, sometimes they would just drown the child. Christianity, so there's a differentiation between healthy child in a Roman family versus unhealthy child who's got weaknesses. So that's a differentiation, right? Christianity doesn't
yeah,
say there's no difference at all, nothing to do different to the handicapped child in terms of extra treatment or anything like that. There's no difference. It's the same exact thing as someone who is born without any health problems. Christianity doesn't say that. That's kind of an egalitarian move where it's like there's no difference. Everything's all undifferentiated. But what Christianity would say is like, you're not going to mediate that difference through violence. You're not going to kill the handicap just because there's going to be extra burdens to take care of that in terms of the Roman Empire's time, the economic burden of having to care for one that is more needy and more prone to die. Christianity says, no, we're going to create a society, and that's what Jesus is doing, by the way, and has done, in which we can have the resources available, the plenty available to take care of that handicapped child and give it the full access to have a life of dignity, right? Just as it was if it was a child without any afflictions. You see what I mean?
right,
So there's not this violent attempt to extinguish the difference between healthy body versus something is afflicting the body or mind. That's what egalitarianism does. It tries to create chaotic violence to make all differences go away by force. It tries to say, no, we're
Right.
going to respect. There are differences, meaning there are different considerations for how we will help. This baby would need extra care. And we're not going to use violence to mediate the difference between this. And the same thing goes for hierarchy. So hierarchy is a little bit different from differentiation. It's a type of differentiation, but hierarchy might be, someone owns a shop and they hire labor to maintain their shop. Now, in the Roman Empire, if you were hiring labor, you might hire slaves, and those slaves were your possession. You could do what you want to do and use them however you wanted in all kinds of ways. Christianity says, no, we're not going to eliminate the hierarchy. If you're the owner of the shop, you can still have the final say over how the shop will be maintained. But we're not going to do it in a way which is violently mediated, where the shop owner can have full access to the labor of his workers, can exploit them, can sexually, do whatever. No, we're not going to allow violence to mediate that hierarchy. We're going to allow the hierarchy to exist if it's a natural hierarchy, but it will have to be in relationship that is voluntarily mediated with grace, love, binding it together. Does that make sense, sir?
Yeah, I mean, to add some historical examples to what you're saying, it's not just the hierarchy, it's also cross-tribal relationships. So, for example, uh, there's this famous researcher by the name of Rodney Stark who wrote about the early Christians and how they operated under the Roman Empire. So he cites the Roman officials, Roman authority, when it says that when there was some earthquake, I think that was a natural disaster that had just struck a Roman city. The Christians not only cared for their own, but they also cared for the pagans. They were also helping the pagans. So it's and he was this Roman administrator was in shock as to why that was. How were people capable of such things? When they will just, like it's like the historical example of the Great Samaritan parable. It's like it's Jesus's a good Samaritan parable manifesting in history in real time right there. So like it's like you said, like they're not going around. Like there are two ways you can take on hierarchical society. One is through egalitarianism, as you mentioned and talked about. This like just throwing out the baby with the bathwater kind of approach. It's just getting rid of every boundary that's ever existed and just descend into chaos. But the other way we can approach it is through the way of Jesus, right? And the way of voluntary persuasion, without the need to dismiss hierarchy, without the need to dismiss boundaries, tribal boundaries, ethnic boundaries, and so on. Because the good and people don't realize this is that if we in modern times told a story about the Good Samaritan, we would say something like, okay, this New Yorker found another New Yorker lying on the sidewalk, and and he just took care of them. There's no appeal to that, right? But what makes the story so amazing is that if you replace the New Yorker with a Floridian or something, like, if you made it about an American helping a Russian, or a Russian helping an American, that would really set people's
Right.
brains off. And the reason why
Yeah,
is
that's
like
if
it's
like if
showing you a
yeah,
world.
let me give me an example. If these so-called progressive pastors were to tell a story about the good Trump supporter who goes to the need of the transgender guy beaten on the side of the road and gives him a hotel and makes sure all of his bills are paid for his medical care, that would be somewhat close to
Yeah.
to the power of what Jesus was saying at the time, which, by the way, you're never going to hear that. And if you do, send it to me. I'd like to see the link of a progressive Democrat, evangelical, or whatever Christian pastor, or some lesbian priest in the Church of
Right.
Anglicanism make a sermon about the good white nationalists or something extreme that they hate, you know. And
Yeah.
I'd like to see that happen, but they can't do that
Yeah.
because they're still operating on mythic violence, and that just shows you that all of man's attempts to imitate Christian of Jesus's kingdom in a violent way will all be made rendered to look stupid in the grand scheme of history. And we're just in it right now. We're in our epoch of history. It's harder to see how much our ideological cul-de-sacs and mythologies pale in comparison because you're in it. And so you don't realize, how pathetic they really are to the radical nature of what Jesus is doing. And that's why, like I was going to say, there's the trap that Jesus sets for cultures that have been exposed to his message and his kingdom is that you have
Right.
two choices. You can imitate him the right way, or you can imitate him in a rivalrous way, which will sow your eventual destruction. So you
Right.
don't. That's what Jesus says when he says, "When I am lifted up on the cross, I will draw all men unto me." Meaning, it's an irresistible magnetism, his kingdom, and there's no way to break out of it in a way that discards the logic of his kingdom. Try as the Nietzsche fans want, they can't do it. They're literally in a kind of a psychological break from reality. Just like, unfortunately, Nietzsche, the founder of their whole philosophy, had to suffer the same thing. They're in a psychological break from reality, which is in its milder forms is just a fantasy. We can go back to the days of the good old days before all this weak victimism started or whatever. But they can't, because the weak victimism they see are all errors in rivalrous imitation to Jesus's kingdom and earth. The good stuff that's happening is people imitating Jesus with less of that rivalry infecting their intentions. And that's the good stuff, right? That's where society happens. That's where progress happens. That's where wealth happens. That's where healing happens. That's where cures for disease happen. That's where technological revolutions happen. But the world is, of course, slow to fully embrace it. We all are. And so our other way engaging in the world today is in a kind of rivalry. Because, for example, let me tell you something, man. These people that follow like Bronze Age perverts, none of these people really believe what they're saying, right? Like, none of them are going to say, "Yeah, I think we should exterminate handicapped people." That's what Nietzsche really, his philosophy ultimately ends in that, right? None of them say that.
Well, there's a
So
good.
I just want to make that clear. None of them say that. So they are
They can't.
thoroughly Christianized, even in their little attempt to LARP, like they can escape the Christian framework. They can't.
Well,
They
let me just
can't.
make a point. Let me make a point here. Uh, uh, when you say they've been thoroughly Christianized, it really means that Jesus has changed the fabric of society. It has changed not only the fabric of society, but the fabric of reality,
Exactly.
right? Because it's impossible. I mean, it's literally physically impossible to say, even make those kind of statements right now. And a good example is like, if you've read Dostoevsky's novels, his literature, a lot of his characters, nihilistic, atheistic characters, when they try to lean into that Nietzschean spirit, they end up going crazy, and after that they end up committing suicide. And that's a really common theme throughout his novels. And you can see because and people might say, oh no, that's fiction, but Dostoevsky was drawing from actual real people who were living during his time in the influx of liberalism in Russia and all of that chaotic time up. So what that amounts to is that, if people came out, say someone to today's social media culture came out and said that, okay, let's round up all the handicapped people and let's just execute them, not only would that person be ostracized by the left, that person would be also ostracized by the right. And Even the so-called radical people in culture would be think twice to associate with that, because that person is basically like saying it's okay to, it's moral to kill people and innocent people for no reason at all. So this is reality
Even
changed by Christ.
and of course, to be fair, the eugenics thing still tries to find its foothold on the left and the right. The people on the left want to
Yeah,
have,
but it has to take a subtle
yeah, it has to take a mercy orientation. Well, we have to kill the older people because it's mercy for them, or we have to eliminate persons in the womb who have Down syndrome
right.
because it's
I would
mercy
like
for
to
them.
hear an argument from the left that it's okay to kill people because it's cool,
Well, we don't
because
want to.
they cannot. No,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
like, the point I'm trying to say is, like, if this is actually a point I'm making towards the people who say that world is ruled by Satan and Jesus is like on the outliers, on the margins, those kind of people. So I'm saying, if that's the case, then why can't the left make that kind of statement? If the left
Why can't the
makes
right make
that,
that kind of statement? Yeah, they
yeah,
can.
exactly, right. Like the people who say that, who would like to say that, like, let's round up all the crazy people and let's get rid of them from society. Why is it impossible to make those kind of statements, right? Even in pagan societies, people can't make those kind of statements. China, like, people, a lot of people say that China is committing genocide on the Uyghurs. All right, like, let's assume that it is true that China is killing a lot of Uyghurs, and why wouldn't they just come out and say, yeah, it's our country, we would like to do whatever that is beneficial to us, right?
Right. Right.
So and like, even the Armenian genocide, like the Turks are saying like it didn't happen. They have to, but even though there is plenty of historical evidence that it did happen, they still have to say it didn't happen. Why can't they just come out and say we did it? Yeah, it's our moral right to commit genocide.
It's like what they did with this the pandemic, right? They're trying to gaslight.
Right,
It's like, I hate that word, but because everybody uses it for everything, but they're trying to rewrite history in real time. So, oh yeah, we didn't force you to take that garbage product, or we didn't force you to really be locked down. We just suggested that you stay in place, and we didn't really force, people into misinformation about generic products. We were just, they try to rewrite everything in real time because we're playing and operating by Jesus's kingdom's rules, and so even the tyrannical overreaches have to always be kind of couched in all kinds of fancy rhetoric and social manipulation, and just really elaborate apologetics on behalf of really ridiculously evil stuff. And everything has to be oriented towards the victim, right? Everything, and
right,
the victim is the heart and soul of the religiosity of all cultures. And so, if the true God of the universe is coming and breaking into our world and making it his home, along the way, the false gods will have to be destroyed, and they are being destroyed. And that's why it is a good thing that the false gods of the world continue to operate under more and more ridiculous, elaborate claims of victim concern. That's such a good sign. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that they won't victimize a lot of people. For example, I mentioned this point recently on Twitter, just to kind of take an anthropological analysis of the word "our democracy." They use that for everything, right? Our democracy demands us to kill everybody
yeah,
over in Russia and Ukraine. Our democracy demands us to go into
yeah, it has to
Syria.
be.
Yeah, our democracy demands us to lock down your grandma in a nursing home and put all kinds of very sick people that we created a bioweapon and unleashed on them. That's our democracy. That is stupid stuff they use.
Yes, always
Our
our
democracy, our
democracy. Yeah,
democracy wants us to depopulate the world by, convincing young people to not to like mutilate their bodies so they can't reproduce if they have a change of mind later on. All these are democracy things, but the word democracy is it means the people rule, right? And if we take Rene Girard's famous idiom, we didn't invent our gods, we deify our victims. Then if democracy is another modern god, the people rule, then what's really going on is it's the sacrifice of the people. They're using our democracy They're deifying their victims. They're deifying their victims, and they're convincing their victims to go along with their own brutal sacrifice by convincing them that they're being elevated in some way. Our democracy is under threat if we allow a fair count, or if we allow a fair ballot, if we allow a signature verification to determine that wasn't a hoax ballot. That's our democracy under threat. What they're really saying is, we are going to sacrifice the people in the name of the people, but you will feel good about it because you'll be convinced in this fantasy, this kind of fake mythology in real time, that this is the will of the people, is to deny the needs of the people, right? It's a crazy thing, but that's why it won't last.
Yeah, and this is very important. It's like the conversation that we had just recently. It's like this inclination towards saying everything of our democracy, this is for our own good, this is, we are in this together. That's sort of like a lighting term. At the same time, it's also the thing that really makes them vulnerable, because if you are looking at it from the vantage point of an average Joe who is listening to politicians say things like our democracy, that person would say, okay, how is this exactly our, when you're like trying to take when you're trying to make sure that I don't have any children, that I don't have any descendants, and that my lifespan is going to be substantially decreased
I'm going to be in
by
debt the
taking all
rest of
of
my
these.
life to afford a car and a
Yeah,
home. I mean, think about this.
yeah.
Did the average American have to be in debt their whole life to have a car and a home in the 1776? No. You know what I'm
No,
saying?
yeah.
So obviously there's been a decline in the standard of living from then till now. I mean, you can look at different periods of history. You can look at
Yeah, and
19. Yeah.
that's why there are even that's why there are you have people like Jimmy Dore, Russell Brand, and these people who are, even though they are on the left and they are liberal, they still cannot buy into these neoliberal or whatever you want to call it, narratives like, okay, this is for your own good, like don't question the science and all of these things. Is because by following these narratives, we are putting the nail in our own coffins, right? So this is like when politicians say things like our democracy, it's like a self own
Yeah.
in the reality of Jesus
Yeah.
Christ. If they would have been probably able to get away with it, although they look very stupid in pre-Christian times, by saying things like our democracy. The people at that time would say, why are you trying to make an excuse, just do the thing already. But in our times, they are really doing a massive self rebuttal, giving ammunition to the dissidents, right? By when they are saying things like our
Yeah.
democracy,
Yeah,
right?
our
So
democracy, and it's been particularly illuminating to watch how slow. It's not slow. It's fast in terms of recent history, but the whole January 6th thing, like the conservative movement woke
right.
up relatively quick to the realization that January 6th thing may have been government manipulated in terms of inciting this riot and kind of like, setting it up and with a lot of intention behind it. A lot of folks are still shocked though. Like they're quick to realize, but they're slow to fully accept and process the reality of it, right? Because they still believe in the myth of civic nationalism. They still believe that America's institutions were relatively benevolent, right? These giant federal institutions and bureaucracies were relatively benevolent and life affirming and personhood oriented and trustworthy, and they didn't realize how that had been not the case for quite a long time. I mean, all powers at their central level are going to be necessarily untrustworthy because of how far removed they are from the way in which Jesus says to love your neighbor. So that's a clear thing from the get-go, whether you're at George Washington's regime or recent regimes that we have today. But the I've been amazed at how much the the conservative movement has been slow to come to grips with just
Right.
how obvious January 6th was a setup, right? I was saying on the radio way before it happened, this doesn't look right. Something doesn't look right. It just intuitively doesn't make sense. You know, they put out that article about how, in Time magazine, how they had fortified the election and they were so excited about it. And they mentioned how they had a whole network of, activists like Antifa ready to be mobilized on the moment's notice of a text and probably a Venmo payment to be activated in case Trump won the election to create social chaos. And yet at January 6th, there was no large Antifa presence, in terms of what the camera showed. There were nowhere there, but they were apparently, some of them were in the crowd or whatever. And that doesn't excuse, of course, the mob violent aggression that Trump supporters, some of them, engaged in. But the whole thing was an obvious trap, a dialectical trap. That the crowd is a lie, Soren Kierkegaard said. And
Exactly. Yeah.
anytime you try to put a flag with Jesus on it and go get all whipped up and angry with the crowd of thousands and be really angry, that's a stupid anti-Christian thing to do by its. And I told that to people who were, who were at that January 6th. And I said, that was I told them after the fact, when I said, this is a stupid thing for you to do. If you wanted to have a grievance, you should have had, and I've said before, if Trump understood the gospel technology at any level, or had anybody around him helping him see it on a deeper level, he could have had so much more effect if he just did a silent protest like planking in the middle of a desolate part of the road in DC while they were doing their count on January 6th. Just
Well, that's why.
planking
Yeah.
with a silent protest of prostration, laying down face for, kind of a Gandhi style move. That would have done more to enrapture the worldwide culture and the American culture to listen to the grievances of his movement in a much, much more penetrative way, which would have had lasting effect way beyond their wildest imagination. But again, they are still caught up in the logic of the crowd, which is the logic of the state and the false religions of our world.
Well, that's why we have this unconscious, not really, like a lot of people know this, like that's why the right is always uh, seen as the left light, or like 2 steps or 3 steps behind the progressives, right? So it's not because it's not because the left has, it's not simply because the left has a monopoly on all the media, or art, narratives. The left has a monopoly on telling stories. It's not simply because of that, but it's also because the left partially channels that victim aesthetics that they get from Christians,
Yeah.
society, of the siding with the
Right.
marginalized.
Right.
uh yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to
So
say that, but and that's something that we've emphasized a lot over the years, is that, and I've tell people all the time, the left is more effective at owning culture. The reason why they do make art and the reason why they do have monopolies on entertainment is because they more viscerally, for whatever reason, imitate the aesthetic and the ethics of Christianity. Now, the person will say, "Well, that's not true. Look, they do abortion, blah blah blah." But that again is a tell as to the objective reality that the kingdom of heaven that Jesus inaugurated in history has created. Because if you think that, so this goes back to our original point, sir, is that if you think that advancing the kingdom of heaven is telling people about the metaphysical claims or the historical claims of, the church, and then if you just axiomatically accept that and then go through the rituals or whatever they tell you to do, that's being a part of the kingdom of heaven, then you're missing the boat. And that's why you have no idea why the left owns culture, right? Because the left more effectively, in a fraudulent way, as all human deviations from the truth
yeah.
are, the left more effectively harnesses the same feeling that Christianity unleashes in culture than the right wing conservative or, whatever traditionalist reaction to it does. Right. Because,
I mean,
and that goes to show, just to put the point again, that Christianity is affecting us on an objective level that you may not know at all if you think Christianity is about just axiomatically mentally assenting to propositional claims. Because if you take the average conservative out of a crowd and the average leftist, and you bring them up and you give them a quiz about, doctrinal mental assent for Christianity, maybe statistically the conservative might get more correct answers or not. But is that really how the kingdom of heaven is fully actually advancing in culture, or is it actually advancing through mimetic concern for the least of these? And if the left can tap into that feeling of that, even though they're directing it into violent, false answers,
Right.
it will have more of the cultural cachet, right?
Yeah, I mean, like look at the highest, and I'm just giving an example here. Look at the highest grossing movie that exists today. It's about a bunch of humans invading the tribal planet of a bunch of blue people, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of narrative does not exist in pre-Christian societies. That kind of narrative, about the colonizers being the bad guys, and the blue, scantily clothed people being the victims. They're just trying to preserve their way of life. They're technologically inferior, those are the good guys. Like that kind of narrative only can exist in a post-Christian, like not post-Christian, say per se, like a Christian saturated culture, right?
Right.
So that's the highest grossing
A
movie
kingdom
that
of God owned culture. Let's put it clear. It's
right,
a
right,
kingdom of
exactly.
God owned culture that in its rebellion has to still play within the framework of the stone the builders rejected. So
Yeah, that's
again,
the like the highest grossing. Like a lot. Let's make this clear even more.
all
The
of the movies,
leftists
but no,
produce
all 50 of the top highest grossing
right,
movies are dealing with the
right.
same thing. Look at Titanic. That was the other one that same director made that was at the top of the box office. That's a
Yeah,
story about a rich girl of privilege who has to literally descend into the bowels of poverty to fully realize the meaning of
right,
life. It's like the
right.
harrowing of hell. She has to go down into the depths of this archetypal poor guy from the Leonardo
Yeah.
DiCaprio figure. All right.
And Leonardo DiCaprio is like the self-sacrificing.
Yeah, the self-sacrificial peasant who has to lay down his life so that this
Even though there was room.
this rich girl of privilege can have a place at the seat of riches and glory with that big old sapphire that she throws, and that's why she throws away the
Right.
sapphire, right? That's a
Right.
metaphor for the Christ-haunted West trying to throw away its wealth by gutting
Right.
its economy,
Exactly.
gutting its economy. But again, to my little anti-Christian pagan friends, right, who might be listening to this,
Right.
we want to engage with you too. That doesn't mean that comes from Christianity. That comes from a Christ haunted or kingdom of heaven directed or owned society that's trying to violently react, right, to that call of true repentance and mercy and self-emptying knowledge of the neighbor, and try to reorient it into a myth that still allows for violence to be mediated and scapegoating to be applied, and for good and evil to be delineated between individuals rather than cut through the human heart, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn says so famously. So
Yeah,
that's the point, right? Is that
it's like being haunted by a ghost. It's like being haunted by a ghost, right?
right,
It's not saying that the ghost made him do it, the ghost made these guys do it. It's like, okay, this guy is traumatized by
right,
the ghost,
right,
and he's having a PTSD, but he's like trying to make sense of it all.
right.
Under the light that he has seen a ghost, and we're just saying that the ghost is Jesus dying on the cross. Western people, in particular, can't get it out of their subconscious.
Yeah,
It's simply not possible. I
right.
mean, the
But
world as it is haunted by it. But the Western people, they can talk all day about Nietzsche. They can talk all day about vivifying the pagan sacred and all of that. But it's just antithetical to their nature. It's not happening.
and life is art, and the gospel texts are art, kind of like a meta art that kind of reveal the truth of history and art and human existence and the human mind. uh And it predicts this. The passage. Let me give you an example. We've talked about this before years, but I'll say it again because it's always worth repeating. People never hear these things because somehow they miss the episodes where we talk about it. But with Barabbas, right? The story of Barabbas, Jesus is brought before the crowd. Pilate says, "Who do you want to save, and who do you want to be crucified, Barabbas or Jesus?" And you think, "Oh, that's pretty clear." You got Barabbas, who's a serial killer, and Jesus, who's this loving guy. And somehow the crowd is so insane that they want the serial killer free. Now, why do we tell that story that way? Because we don't want to be situated in the crowd. We don't want to be situated. The human species still doesn't want to be situated as one of the people who truly would understand why they would choose the person they chose to save and eliminate the person they chose to eliminate. So we want to make it like that crowd was just a maddened mob, so deranged with hate that they wanted a serial killer to be freed, Barabbas, and this wonderful, sweet, loving guy, Jesus, to be killed. That's not that's the way of trying to. We are, by interpreting that story that way, it's first of all, it's not what the text actually says. And second of all, it's a way of us psychologically creating distance between us and that crowd because we don't want the gospel to read us in our time today. So if we let the gospel read us in our time today, here's what's really going on. The earliest texts say that that Pilate brings out Barabbas, whose name is Jesus Barabbas. Jesus, Bar of Abba the Father. Jesus, Son of the Father, versus Jesus, Son of the Father. The text is making it very clear. With that rendering, you get such a more illuminating opportunity if your heart is willing to receive that humility, which is, okay, we have two Jesuses here. Two Jesuses that stand on trial by government, the greatest government the empire had ever, the greatest empire the world had ever known, and a crowd, which are actually mirrors of one another. The crowd is the heart of the empire because Pilate is kind of rather confused as to why he needs to go along with executing this guy. But he has to surrender to the power of the mob demanding that Jesus be executed. And so he submits his will. The greatest empire submits his will to a crowd of people that they actually own and occupy. Whoa. So that gives you an opening of what the heart of empire is and all of its majesty. That story, by the way, just totally eviscerates all politics. People want to read Machiavelli. You don't need to read it. Read that story and you'll understand. The Bible rips apart the heart of our conception of polity more than any other story before or after. And so you go to that story and you say, two Jesuses presented. That crowd represents all human cultures, all human societies, present, past, at the time, in the future, whatever. And the crowd is given the choice. Who do you stand with? The one who says, forgive your enemies, including the Romans, and says, make peace with those who've oppressed you, heal the land with forgiveness and mercy, saturating your relationships? Or the one who, Barabbas was not a serial killer, he was a violent resistor of the Roman Empire. He wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire. Now, what's interesting about this, why is that the story that we get? Because at that point in history, we're going to move to a kind of state mythology, which will more and more look like the Barabbas ethic, which is down with these Roman oppressors, let's overthrow it by force, and let's get the good guys back in power. So the pre-period, before this story happens, revolutions were happening, but the power of mythology was such that people were not tempted by violent revolutionary overthrow quite with the same universal appeal that we now have today, right? So the gospel in that story is actually making a prophecy. It's saying that humans, when given the choice, will think that they're mentally assenting to the right Jesus, right? They'll say the name Jesus while they will continue to crucify Jesuses in history. They will continue to believe that they are mentally assenting to Jesus and his kingdom while still expelling and murdering many Jesuses in the future. That's why Jesus says, When you've visited the poor, when you've visited the hunger, when you visited the naked, you have visited me. Because that's how you actually enter into that text and understand what it's saying about our culture. It's a prophecy that people, that's why it says two Jesuses, because it wants you to see, as the recipient of this gospel technology, that humans will continue to choose in their minds, they will mentally assent to Jesus, Son of the Father, because Barabbas's name axiomatically looks like mental assent to the historical Jesus, just on the surface. I mean, obviously they didn't see it that way. There was just, Yeshua was a common name, Jesus was a common name of that time, but just on the surface, as us reading that text, they've picked the right thing metaphysically. They've picked the mental assent. They've said, we want to save Jesus, Son of the Father. That one, not the other one. Okay, it's kind of an arbitrary like coin toss. Which Jesus, Son of the Father? We picked that one. Well, mentally assent-wise, it sounds like they're mentally assenting to the truth that Jesus comes of the Father. But it's not true, because their father is the crowd. Their father is actually the crowd of humanity groping and grasping to make Jesus in their own image. And ever since then, every violent revolutionary overthrow has always been this crowd believing they're on the side of Jesus, so to speak, when in reality they're expelling or murdering Jesus.
Yeah, that's true. And we still like this drives home the fact that we still have a choice as human beings, each of us individually, that either we accept the Jesus who unraveled history and makes it impossible for us to hate our neighbor and to persecute our neighbor, or we uh you know believe, that's right, coming full circle here, believe in the Jesus that you know uh, is a revolutionary. And unfortunately, it's not just a problem with the left, it's a problem with the right too, right?
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
the right also believes that there will come a time when Jesus will come and spread violence and overthrow the antichrist and his forces in a physical violent
Right.
scapegoating fashion.
And that's the greatest idolatry of church, on all these institutional churches, is they all kind of have that belief. And even the progressive ones who reject that kind of view of a violent Jesus coming back to do ninja kicks to everybody,
Right,
they still they function that way, right? Because they want to violently expel and believe in the stupid myths that the television tells
right.
them, with no kind of epistemological like humility or skepticism about powerful oligarchs and so forth. So so they're enraptured to that too. But you're totally right that the biggest hindrance, I think, one of the biggest hindrances of church being able to have its renaissance and its effect in society, is that most Christians still hold on to the same error that the Jews did when they encountered Jesus in history, which is we don't want a nonviolent Jesus. We want a violent, gonna kick our enemies Jesus.
Yeah, basically we want a mimetic double of Caesar.
Yeah. So they're still so and it really I mean I think it really irritates me that, because you look at every lesson, every story that Jesus tells, and it's all saturated with this upending of this desire to beat our oppressors with violence. Every aspect of his life is constantly his first sermon. He leaves out the passage about in Isaiah about the vengeance of the Lord will be upon our enemies.
Yeah, he doesn't cite that verse
Yeah.
at all.
And
Like,
that's
that's
why they're
very
enraged
interesting.
at him. Like the very opening of his ministry is that way. And every lesson he tells is always upending people's enemy other distinctions, and always trying to basically say, look, we're going to create a universal kingdom, and this enemy other thing is not compatible with that. And you're going to have to learn how to find nonviolent creative means of breaking the power of your oppressors through love and innovation and perseverance and resilience and courage to face down the threat of death. That's the tools you're going to have to build this kingdom, and you can't fall back on it comes some kind of revenge fantasy. And unfortunately, the church is still, by and large, are making the same mistake that the first people do. And the thing that's so heartbreaking about it is that they recognize, they all recognize, oh yeah, Jesus's people didn't accept him because they were so blinded looking for their violent king Messiah. And you're like, yes, you're on the right track. And then they go, and now we're going to wait for our violent king Messiah to come back, Jesus. And it's like, so then once they do that move, once you do the move that, yeah, Jesus was nonviolent, forgiving, merciful, gracious, and so forth, in every aspect of his life and words. But then now we're in this in-between time between that and this coming vengeance Jesus. That always gives them the move to hold on to violent, retributive ideologies, you know, alongside their mental assent of Jesus, that he died and he rose and buried again.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's because you can always say in your heart, well, Jesus can't really want me to self-examine the violence of my ideology, because I'm only doing so in a kind of self-defense move, which is not outside the scope of what Jesus will do when he defends me from these violent kings in the end of history. So if he could come out violently and violently start killing all the kings with bloodshed and sword stabbing them, then why can't I hire a William Wallace to defend me? Why can't I hire a little Caesar who will split the difference between the suffering servant era of Jesus and this vengeful king era of Jesus, which is identical to every pagan mythology ever conceived? And so when you split the difference between the suffering servant mode of Jesus and this coming vengeful king, all you get is just another victim garbed grab for violent power. See, you're still back to might makes right, because you don't allow the gospel to fully penetrate your own, your own agenda, your own in crowd, your own moral certitude, right?
Right. And to like to pivot to a more optimistic way of looking at history is like we were talking about hierarchies, and it just made me think like the mobility within the hierarchical system in the modern world as we see it is kind of showing us that we are moving, if ever so slowly, towards that the kingdom of God where Jesus rules, over the world, and he defeats death. Is that we're already seeing these glimpses of you know the kingdom of Christ, the future kingdom of Christ in the modern world. And one example is, which I just mentioned, is the mobility within the hierarchy. So when we were talking about the class system and all of that, you really could not move. If you were a son of a cobbler, you were stuck in that profession, right? You were not allowed to mingle with people of other statuses. But right now, I mean, just look at the social media world. Someone like a Logan Paul is being looked at the same way as someone like a celebrity, a curated celebrity, right? So I mean, that's just one glimpse of it. And also, we are seeing this increasing call for, as the pandemic was going on, this increasing call for, uh, uh, medical freedom. Like people had the right to know what was being put into their bodies. And, these, I would say a very silent majority. I think a lot of people uh, are in agreement with the dissident scientists who were against the medical mandates that was happening during the pandemic.
Right.
and
Yeah. The,
that's a sign of things to come,
yeah.
and
The
we
good
are moving
news,
in that direction.
and the good news is that, like, I've used this. I think I used this example. I know I've said it offline, but I don't know if I think I've said it
Can you hear
online
me?
too. Yeah. Can you hear me? Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yeah. The good news is that because of the gospel's relationship to, okay, so the gospel is a media technology. It allows us to see our culture in a different light and allows us to make peace with our neighbor and to stop scapegoating some other group as the bane of our society. And that opens up, with that awareness comes the ability to move away from mythic solutions for society, which are political, really, and which are obviously going to be zero sum solutions that hurt somebody or harm somebody, tax somebody, regulate somebody, or cast out somebody for somebody else's benefit. That's mythology, right? And mythology can't grow wealth with uh, a kind of win-win scenario. The gospel is about growing wealth and healing and opportunities and imagination and creative opportunities for everybody. Uh, but it recognizes differences. It recognizes some natural hierarchies of talents and division of labor, as you mentioned. Um, but all of this is something that we can't really understand what our calling is until we realize how important using that gospel technology to then create technologies that extend man's ability to have dignity for every human person. And so that's why I go back to my message that I talk about so often about the need to create radical technologies in the world of atoms where people still need to exist, right? We're incarnated creatures, which means we need to incarnate the truth in every subatomic particle and use those subatomic particles to the glory of God to dignify every human person, no matter who they are and what their differences may be with us. And that means having a kind of vocation to do radical challenges to scientific orthodoxy so that just like we defend the least of these in our society, we also defend the least of these marginalized heretics in the scientific discourse, particularly in the realm of engineering and energy production and so forth. So I want to keep that in mind. Doesn't mean every quack is right. It just means that if you find if you find the truth in science, it will probably be closer to a manger type setting than it will be a high ivory tower of academia. Does that make sense, sir?
Yeah, basically, like we can discern what is true science, true innovation by trusting our instincts, that we cultural traditional instincts that we inherited from our Christ haunted ancestors,
Right,
right?
right. And not just Christ
So,
haunted, but Christ affirming, and the idea of
yeah,
that truth
yeah,
doesn't have to be mediated by might. You know, if you are in opposition to the established orthodoxy of your field, you don't have a lot of power. You don't have a lot of might, right? From an earthly standpoint. But from a Christian standpoint, it doesn't mean you're right, but it means that you might actually be correct. And your position of being in a minority position does not determine your ability to have your scientific theory and evidence presented, right? Today's scientific peer papers, you have to be in the in crowd to even be allowed to publish. So the whole thing is still sacrificially laced to exclude game changing, dogma disrupting notions of how physics or whatever works, right? And so therefore, that
right,
insular that insular conservative position, which of course is protected by sacrificially mediated money. The state is what dominates scientific funding, and the state takes its money by force, by theft of taxation or theft of inflation, without consent, without any kind of competition. And then it takes that money and it allocates it to deeply captured interests, which protect paradigms of science from being disrupted in a more natural, healthy way. And so all that to say, we have work to do to bring these ideas to the public and to try to bring them to folks who can advance culture in art and advance culture with science and engineering marvels that are going to are going to fly in the face of scientific orthodoxy. And that's a good thing. That's an exciting thing. You should be exhilarated with that call. That is good news that we have that ability right under our noses. And we need to stop believing the lies that everything has been settled by the myth makers of our time. So, two more points about that. One, just to go back to what we're able to do with gospel technology opens up technology to flourish for the human good. That also includes technology that will be designed for more media technology. So the gospel technology is a media technology. It starts with text, written text that you read about an account about a man named Jesus and the things that happened to him and the things that he said and the things that he did and the things that he set in motion in history. And then you mimetically you are invited to imitate that and to imitate that spirit and imitate that attitude and imitate that epistemology that Jesus unlocks by his actions, by his example. And you're able to carry that on through history. And when you do that, of course, you're going to have advances in science and technology with that spirit in mind. And that includes technologies to make media transmission of ideas and information even more integrative, right? And that's what we have today. In World War I, Bolshevism and so forth, in the 20th century, Bolshevism comes around and communism comes around, or it comes before that, but it starts being applied in the Russian Revolution. And the intellectual class is like, oh, this is an interesting experiment. Maybe this is the modern ideology of the future. Maybe this is the new scientific revolutionary political philosophy that we should all emulate. And so they let that play out for a long time. And a lot of people get run down and murdered and horribly destroyed by this wicked ideology claiming to be in the name of victims. Today, we just recently went through a pandemic in which people tried to ideologically impose tyrannical mechanisms around the whole world. But because of the advancement of media technologies, spurred on by people with a creative spirit to be a misfit and not be rejected, and to say, hey, how do we make silicon chips? How do we make a computer? How do we make a smartphone? How do we make, all these different things? How do we make high-speed internet? This kind of spirit of radical creativity is still permeating as such that now, because of media technology being so much more advanced and decentralized, where you can do podcasts, you can do live streams, you can do tweets and posts and interactions with your community in a way more decentralized information network. Now, we were, as a whole, humanity was able to check and real-time fact check the ideological imposition that the pandemic was used for in real time, way faster than humanity was able to check the Bolshevism lie with the media technologies that they were afforded at that time. So you see, within 100 years difference, the gospel is filling the earth as Jesus predicts, using Habakkuk chapter 2, where the prophet says, the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the ocean is filled with water. We can see this literally happening, exponentially so, because of the relationship between technological innovations and the spreading of the knowledge of the Lord and the slain victim. And that way, humanity is much more quick on the draw to be aware of the latest form of victim-garbed tyranny and expose it in real time with nonviolent mechanisms. Thanks be to God, the people who were being exposed to the lies of the pandemic didn't react with violent mob violence. They reacted with nonviolent sharing of information about drugs that might help them. That was
and many of them were
nonviolent gospel way of responding to the tyranny, to get out
and
there.
many of them were successful, right? Like the
Right.
freedom convoys and the numerous people who won lawsuits and so on. Like
that's exactly. So that's a great example. I'm just using Bolshevism, which still has its effects in the world today, mostly more, in different forms and hidden ways, and it's still being repudiated in real time. But these things are slow to, humans are slow to repent of their errors and their groupthink, and they're slow to see their groupthink, especially when it's guised under the cover of gospel style, defense of the least of these. But nevertheless, the pandemic was this giant attempt to create, lockdown societies and bullying tactics and identification with the mask and all these different things. And it was in real time able to be exposed and unveiled as it was happening, where Bolshevism was not given that same check. And we should say, thanks be to God. That is the power of Jesus as king of history, working with a sorry lot of humans who are slow to use their free will in the right ways and with courage. He's working with the worst team in the world, the human species, but it's not the worst team in the world. We're being a little bit facetious, but it's the team he wants to have in the world. We are meant to be the image. I like the way N.T. Wright says that when God creates the earth and he creates this universe, he creates human beings to be the image. That, like when you go into a temple, you look at, okay, who is this temple for? You see an idol. You say, oh, that's the image. So it's the temple of Zeus. And I see the way that idol look. It's gold or whatever it is. But God made us to be the image of his temple, of his home, right? To reflect him, to be his icon, right? To be his icon. And we are his icon the more we become like the greatest icon of history, Jesus. And that's an exciting thing because it allows us to pierce through the veil of all these mythologies and to be able to bring the future into the present now, to bring how humanity will be in the future, loving, gracious, having differences, but having differences with love and mercy saturating it, not violence and exclusion. All those things are exciting to be able to choose today to participate in that inbreaking of the future into the present because of the power of Jesus giving us the courage to try it and to do it and to try it ever so harder the next day, the next day, the next day in all of our relationships. That's exhilarating. It's exhilarating.
Yeah.
Doesn't this
And
Christianity more exciting than the thing that people think it is? I mean, goodness gracious. Oh.
yeah, I mean, like the greatest part about all of this is that Jesus rules history, right? He is in charge. So we often, in our opposition to the forces, the authoritarians, make it out like they're the ones who are going to like they make predictions of things like transhumanism and 15-minute cities and so on and so on, but we often take their predictions as something like prophecies. But really, like, there's so many obstacles to these things, and that just proves that is in charge of history. It's not going to be such an easy task for these enemies of humanity. It's going to be far more easier for those of us who choose to imitate Christ and you know make the kingdom of God the same as it is in earth, right?
Right. And that is to take that which is unseen and make it seen.
Right.
I want to go
But it's
back.
not even unseen. It's not even unseen though, right? We still see the manifestations of Jesus's uh, you know, life of non-violence. We see it all around us all the time. Like the fact that they can't put us in front of a firing squad, and that they have to use terms as our democracy. That's very much seen too.
That takes me back to this article that I promised I'd get to. We had such a great discussion, almost left no time for it, but it's worth trying to push
Uh,
it out. This
uh,
anti-humanism article by Matthew Crawford and First Things. I pulled a few quotes from it because I think it's going to make sense after we've layered the cake of what we've been building today in conversation. Liberalism begins with the politics of emergency, then. Leviathan, he's referring to Thomas Hobbes' version of Leviathan. Leviathan is supposed to end this state of emergency. That is the whole point of it. But the emergency must be renewed over and over again if Leviathan is to thrive. This requires renewal of the consciousness raising program as well, cultivating the vulnerable self. This is the self that is implicit in the cult of safetyism that children are brought up in. It's also the guy you see riding his bicycle double masked. So he's saying that this modern Leviathan of the West that we're under right now, the hegemony, the power of our world, it has to constantly renew itself with states of emergency. It has to constantly create. That's what we call engineering a sacrificial crisis. What Rene Girard would
Right.
say, a mimetic state of undifferentiation. So
Right. There's a harvest failure, so that's why we need a sacrifice to appease the god.
right. And so but the difference is that because so many things have been achieved where we don't have to have famines like we did before, now we have to manufacture emergency like situations. You see what I mean? Some
Yeah,
bozos
artificially create. Yeah.
exactly, some bozos had to create this stupid, I'm trying to use words so we can keep this on the, bozo owned platform, YouTube and so forth. But these bozos create this artificial thing, right? And then it's like, oops, it's unleashed and all this stuff. They sneeze and all of a sudden the whole world's got this thing. It's like times are so good, we don't need to have crop failures to create crisis. So we have to these administrators of Leviathan have to create these emergencies, right? They have to create these artificial boom busts, right, where they artificially, lower the price of money and with the central banks, and they create these manias, they
Yeah.
create these bubbles, and they break them, and that creates, when you break them, all of a sudden there's a state of undifferentiation because everybody's poor and leveled down, and everybody needs their bailout, and they impose some new draconian tyrannical economic policy on them. That's the same thing. The same move is being done over and over again that ancient times they literally had to go through because plagues would happen and famines would happen, and it was out of their league to be able to figure out how to deal with. Now, because of Jesus allowing us to master so many things in the world where plagues and famines are not quite as acute, especially in Christ saturated cultures, guess what? These wicked Leviathan folks have to manufacture crises, emergencies to get more power and more tyranny in the name of protecting the victim. That's what he talks about with safetyism. Safetyism is just another form of victim garbed, imitation of Christianity that's actually tyrannical. I want to go on here. There is a cult-like quality to public spaces in the Bay Area where I live, Matthew Crawford writes, with lots of people wearing masks outdoors. You have to think they know the facts by now. It may be that they are acting not out of fear for themselves or for others, but in a gesture of identification with the vulnerable one. That's capital words he uses, vulnerable one who is currently elevated, which is the immunocompromised. You see the gospel technology there, guys? Sir, you see that?
Yes. Yes.
He usually,
Definitely. Like I don't think Matthew Crawford.
yeah,
Yeah.
he uses the capital word vulnerable one who is currently elevated. In this case, it's the immunocompromised in that crisis.
Yeah. That's basically the one who is scapegoated, right?
That's the one who is elevated, the vulnerable one.
Yes. Yes. Deified. The deified victim. That's why Girard said we deify our victims, right?
Right.
We
Yeah,
don't
he's supposed
simply create gods
right.
out of thin air.
Exactly. So you're saying that there's multiple levels here. So yes, the crisis was created by powers and principalities with this manufactured thing that comes around the world, this engineered thing, right? And it comes out, it creates all these vulnerable ones vulnerable to what? To death. And then they deify them by saying, well, we must, do all these draconian tyrannical things to protect the vulnerable one, the slain lamb since the foundation of the world, the victim, the scapegoat. And in this case, it's the one who has the likelihood of having sickness and death from this thing that they created. So they have to literally create a kind of gospel drama in order to maintain their power.
Right.
Isn't that amazing? I want folks, but folks, by the way, I'm sorry, I don't want to, it's just so exciting. Nobody's talking about this in the public. So it's really exciting to share this with you because it's just like, people are getting this, but they're not putting it all together in this holistic picture about what Jesus is all about and how it works in history. Um, but it takes a little bit of to
Yeah,
understand the gospel.
it just shows us. Yeah, it just shows us how people are even catching on to
Yeah,
what we're talking about, right? Like people are catching on to this like when they're able to describe it in such a manner as Matthew Crawford is here doing, is that they are artificially creating all of these crises under the pretext of protecting the vulnerable one, right? The one that vulnerable to death. So that's like part of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, I think, right? Yeah, that we spoke about, as the foot of the statue is partially clay,
it's chapter
and the clay is the vulnerable one.
Daniel chapter 2, I think, is that one, but it's the one with the iron mixed with clay, right? And it's brittle because of its humanity being exposed, right?
Yeah.
It's weak because you can't create tyranny based on trying to pretend to be the vulnerable one. It won't work. Folks, you're seeing this. I want to tell you, you're right, sir. It's the Daniel chapter 2 thing. Now, I may be wrong on the chat. I don't really care about chat because that wasn't in the actual text, but whatever it was. It's that story in Daniel about
Well, it's the
the
prophecy. Yeah.
prophecy. And it's the same thing I said in Habakkuk chapter 2. That Jesus proclaims to be a prophecy. He says, when these people are silent, meaning the people who are praising his name as he comes into Jerusalem, when they're silent, when they stab me in the back, in other words, the stones of the walls will cry out. He's quoting Habakkuk chapter 2. When you read on in that text, it says, when the stones of the wall cry out, eventually the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the ocean is wet. So, ladies and gentlemen, when these globalist powers, in order to keep their grasping at more tyrannical control, have to literally create a theodrama, a gospel drama, to maintain tyrannical powers. The knowledge of the Lord is filling the earth as the ocean is wet, and they can run, but they can't hide. It's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. You can't escape it. You can't escape it, folks. Jesus is winning in history. But you got to have the big picture
Yeah,
view in mind.
exactly.
You have to have the big picture view in mind to see this, folks. And it's not even that big now. I'm trying to give you chunks. That's why I gave you Bolshevism in the 1900s, early 1900s, to COVIDism, tyrannical. Two types of tyranny moves. One is checked much faster than the other. So I'm trying to show you. So if you can't take 500-year increments or 2,000-year increments of trying to like see the progress of culture and through the lens of Christ, then I'm taking in 100 years increments so you can see it in recent history because you've lived through one of them at least. I don't think anybody alive here has been alive in World War I or Bolshevism's rise, but they went through part of it maybe, depending on how old they are. Note that in this Hobbesian, this is Matthew Crawford again. Let's go back to some of these quotes. Note that in this Hobbesian dynamic, the perpetuation of a sense of crisis is accomplished by highlighting the vulnerability of a particular group of innocents, just as in racial victimology. Perhaps this helps us understand how, in the summer of 2020, the health emergency of COVID and the moral emergency of white supremacism seemed to merge into a single thing. Social distancing guidelines had to be adjusted to accommodate mass protests as these two serve to advance the general crisis. Again, you don't need a conspiracy of hostile elites to explain this. It is sufficient to have a shared political morality that sacralizes the victim, issuing and moral demands that are categorical, even if contradictory.
Yeah.
That sounds like Rene Girard wrote it himself, right? I mean, it sounds like I wrote it. Now, maybe, look, to be fair,
Yeah.
I don't know Matthew Crawford. Maybe he's read from Girard, so maybe he's infected by this, and that doesn't make this quite as cool, but it doesn't matter. It's still the same direction. Whether he's read Rene Girard or not, the truth is truth, and you're going to uncover it the more you look at history through the lens of Jesus Christ. But here we go, folks, sacralizing the victim. And he points out this very strange phenomenon that we all experience. in which the COVID emergency merged with the racial emergency after the death of George Floyd. People were allowed to literally
Mhm.
congregate in mass crowds, coughing and running around, together to blow up, buildings and set things fire and do all kinds of baptismal type rituals and say, I can't breathe together. They were literally speaking the words of the victim that they were sacralizing in real time, the death of George Floyd, right? Turning him into this kind of I can't breathe is one that the Eric Garner guy said too. And they're saying, oh, we can say these words and experience the kind of messianic
Yeah,
salvific
it's
effect. And that was merged.
it,
It was like, okay, they're allowed. Somehow bugs are not going to spread. I mean, literally, I remember the CNN and these folks basically say, well, yeah, but this is such a crisis. Every racial minority is going to be hunted down if this crowd does not do its religious rioting, um, and do this thing. And it's almost like the gods of racial grievances where they were telling, it's basically CNN was basically saying the gods of racial grievances will not allow these folks to spread the pandemic worse, even though they're congregating in crowds, right?
yeah, I mean, like it's very interesting how the crowd, uh, after the death of George Floyd, were trying to do these rituals in a very Christian manner, right? So that speaks to like these are predominantly liberal crowds, the so-called people who were liberated from religion. They like to say. So these people, they didn't do any kind of pagan rituals. They were doing Christian. They were doing like rituals that were, mimicking Christianity in a very resentful manner,
In a rivalrous way. Yeah, exactly.
rivalrous way. Yeah, yeah. So that's like again that speaks to
And,
our
and
insistence that
let me be clear. Here's why it's rivalrous. Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself and to love the enemy other, the Samaritan. And so if you're in a group that feels the need to like otherize another racial group, you have to be able to reconcile with that, but also understand that you can't replace that with another group like people of your same color who don't agree with your politics. You can't otherize them. So it's rivalrous of Jesus's approach to reconciliation to replace in the white liberal mind the raw deal that the black American receives and replace it with the Trumper or the white working class guy and say that's the villain, kick him, kick him, kick him, punch him, don't let him have the say in politics. You see what I mean? That's not, you can't do it that way. If you're
yeah,
following Christ in a non-rivalrous way, you're going to listen and heed his words when he loves his enemies and he sees, you know, he sees his neighbor in his enemies, in his rivals that may have a racial hatred towards him.
yeah. I mean, wokeism is basically Christianity without the love of the enemy other, right? It it cherry picks it cherry picks the defense of the victim, but it chooses to not recognize that there's a possibility of non-violent reconciliation, a non-violent solution to conflict. So once it chooses to once it chooses to see that the straight white male whom they are scapegoating, once it chooses to see that he is also alongside us in humanity, then it's not going to be wokeism anymore. It's going to be just direct imitation of Jesus.
Yes. once it sees that itself, just themselves, you know, once you see that you yourself are oppressor and have the ability to get swept up into ideological violent desires, that's when you're starting to get closer to Christianity.
It's like Girard said, like Christianity is the realization that all of us persecutors.
Exactly. Here's another quote from the Matthew Crawford article in First Things. Victimological dramas provide a mood of permanent moral emergency, justifying an ever deeper penetration of society by bureaucratic authority in both the public and private sectors. The latter includes HR departments and university administration, for example. So, again, victimological dramas, another word of saying that is Christ haunted dramas, provide a mood of permanent moral emergency, justifying an ever deeper penetration of society by bureaucratic authority in both the public and private sectors. In other words, the powers and principalities of the world are using Christ haunted drama scripts in order to create and justify more and more tyrannical control in both public and private sectors. And he mentions the private sector by the HR departments, because those are things that basically police tyrannical style, impositions onto its employees through the HR department, feeding kind of from the government narratives, and university administration also feeding into this. In order to have victims, it helps to have victimizers. This brings us to the final item on the list. We are haters. Here's a quote from Crawford again. We are cruel, we are selfish, we are small-souled in any number of ways. We are prone to hate, if you like. What is novel, I think, is the role that the accusation of hate plays in forestalling the possibility of a politics of solidarity among those who are said to be haters. The majority is demoralized and dispirited through the inculcation of shame at its hateful past, or the attribution of blood guilt that cannot be expiated. Such a population disappears politically through a kind of moral self-erasure, leaving the field relatively clear for top-down projects that may not be popular. That's powerful. That's it for Things Hidden, folks. I appreciate your time. Thank you, sir, for your time and discussing this. And again, you can email us hello@aneighborschoice.com. Godspeed.